Tonight on Nation to Nation, Budget 2018 delivers $4.8 billion in new spending for Indigenous peoples. $16.5 billion over the past 3 years. The political panel debates the success.
What we're going to be doing is monitoring the effectiveness. So I don't think we can say it's making a difference yet. Significant dollars, but we really need to see what the results are.
But could huge budget deficits threaten future funding?
These kinds of deficits eventually lead to severe cutbacks. And as First Nations know, it's often First Nations that are cut first in times of austerity or recession.
Conservation efforts got $1.3 billion. It could be a windfall for Indigenous-led conservation programs.
The most innovative, bold, and frankly successful conservation proposals have all come from Indigenous peoples, and so we expect that trend to continue.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and this is Nation to Nation. Another federal budget was tabled earlier this week, and in a chapter titled Reconciliation, another nearly $4.8 billion was directed to Indigenous peoples. That's on top of the $11.8 billion allocated in the previous 2 years. Some are cautiously optimistic about the spending. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde called it a continual movement in the right direction. Others say it's not enough to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. But now it's time to hear what our regular panel of MPs thinks. Joining me now is Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Services, Don Rusnick, Conservative Shadow Minister for Indigenous Crown Relations, Cathy McLeod, and Nikki Ashton, NDP MP and Jobs Critic. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
As I usually do, I'll start with the opposition here. Ms. McLeod, previous governments in Harper, Chrétien, Martin have never spent this much. How well do you think the money that the Liberal government has spent, especially over the last 3 years, is going to make a difference in people's lives?
So first of all, we support effective investments in things like water, in terms of children, absolutely, education, health. What we're going to be doing is monitoring the effectiveness. So I don't think we can say it's making a difference yet. Significant dollars, but we really need to see what the results are. So we are going to watch, we're going to see what the results are, but you know, the housing I look at as an issue, and what was really missing in this budget, Harold Calla said there will never be enough money to deal with the housing crisis. What we need to do is ensure the prosperity of our communities, and where I would say the big gap and lack is creating that positive economic future, supporting for these communities, whether it be, you know, new ways of looking at resource sharing. So I think that's the big gap, because I think Harold Calla's right, is the housing issue alone is absolutely enormous. We need to find and support communities to be prosperous.
Ms. Ashton, from an NDP perspective, what were the failings or maybe positives of this particular budget?
Well, first of all, we're finally seeing some commitment to child welfare, and you know, this isn't a nice gesture, it's necessary. After 4 directives from the Human Rights Tribunal, we're finally seeing the government move on this, although it remains to be seen whether or not this is adequate funding given the need that exists. I will also say that housing continues to be a major gap. You know, when I visit in First Nations in our constituency, the #1 concern is always housing, and while there is some money in this budget without question, my question is, how quickly will it roll out? Will it get to the communities that need it? Will it translate to you know, construction on the ground? Will it engage local communities in that kind of construction? Or will it just sort of trickle down and then not end up where it needs to go? I will say another major gap is recreation. There is some money for programming, but no money for capital. You know, when I hear about the suicide crisis in communities like Cross Lake and others, I hear from young people that say, we want a drop-in center, we want a rec center. There's nowhere for us to come together in a safe place. And there's no money allotted to that. And I believe that's absolutely key if we're going to listen to young Indigenous peoples.
Mr. Rusnick, you heard that housing seems to still be a concern. There wasn't a lot of new money for housing. The big announcement was it was allocated to different Indigenous groups this time around.
Well, a distinction-based housing strategy is necessary. The needs of First Nation communities are immense. Métis communities and Inuit communities. So $600 million over 3 years is going to be a start in terms of the huge housing gap that we have. But I'm going to agree with Cathy, and we need to do things differently. recently. I spoke at a AFN housing conference in Montreal not so long ago, and we were looking at new ways of doing housing in First Nation communities. We have to be creative, but we have to listen to the communities. The answers are there, and they can't come from Ottawa or the government.
One of the criticisms I've heard about housing is it's shoddy, it's not of good construction. And how do you get it up to a standard so it'll last for 25 years?
Yeah, the minister and I last summer had the opportunity to be in Wanneman Lake and Fort Hope and looking at some of the carpenters doing work on houses and totally gutting them and doing the repairs and upgrades with community members instead of the old way of doing it, hiring people from outside cities, bringing them in, and sometimes very shoddy work done. So this not only creates jobs in the community, it means that community members are actually employed, but they take pride in building houses in their communities, and they do it with the materials, either local or materials that will last.
Ms. Ashton, you already mentioned the money that's being spent on CFS. Does this mean that the tribunal's compliance orders are now satisfied and we can now look forward to seeing that gap close?
Well, we're not entirely sure, and remains to be seen. The figure that has been committed is promising and certainly reflects the, to a certain extent, the need that exists with respect to child welfare. But like I said, I mean, this is the government. We've had this government in place for 3 years. We're finally seeing this money. And again, we'll see how quickly it rolls out. I will say, though, that if we're going to talk about listening and to young people and certainly supporting their needs, it needs to go a lot further. And again, this government talks a lot about reconciliation, but the reality is that it needs to be backed up with investment, and investment that corresponds to the priorities of young people as well.
Ms. McLeod, your opinion on, especially on the amount of money that was given to CFS?
There was a motion in the House many, many months ago now, it might almost be a year ago, where it was unanimous that they needed to comply with the rulings of the HRTC, Human Rights Tribunal. So it's quite late in coming. I mean, they've had, I think Nikki would know, 3 since rulings. Yeah. So, you know what, it's there now, but it really should have been there a long time ago.
Mr. Rusnick, the budget does have a projected deficit of $18.1 billion. How, going forward, how will this maybe hamper how programs and services are delivered to First Nations?
Well, first of all, Todd, I just wanted to address some of the things my colleagues said about CFS. The minister had an emergency meeting a couple weeks ago, and part of getting CFS right is making sure we fix the system. It's not just about throwing money at a broken system. We know that doesn't work, so the minister's been very proactive in terms of listening to the communities, listening to the needs, listening to the youth, to make sure we get this right. So the money's there. We need to reform the system to make sure that we're putting kids first.
Now that system could be in jeopardy in the future, though, if we're running these huge deficits. At some point in the future, we've got to pay for it. What happens to these programs and services?
These are investments and huge amounts of money right now. Of course, we're working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on new agreements in terms of governance, new models of funding, long-term agreements. So I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know where everything's going to go. But the work is underway. We're setting the table for long-term success in First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities.
Ms. McLeod, I know you've brought this up, certainly about the deficits.
We're very critical of the deficits, the fact that they're 3 times larger than they promised, the fact that they had committed to it because it had to be spent on infrastructure. They're not doing that. However, having said that, I mean, the areas that we see that we would not be spending money is in areas such as the Asian Infrastructure Bank, where I think it's $500 million that's going over to build infrastructure in Asia. So we see lots of opportunity to get back to an appropriate balanced budget or fiscally responsible without actually impacting some of the important work that's been done.
Ms. Ashton, you'll get the last word today. Do these huge deficits we're going to have to pay the piper one day.
Well, we're very concerned that that the deficit is being increased with not the kind of investment that will generate the revenue that we need to put back into the economy. Our concern is that oftentimes these kinds of deficits eventually lead to severe cutbacks. And as First Nations know, it's often First Nations that are cut first in times of austerity or recession, and we certainly don't want to see that cycle. It is a question of priorities. Yes, in terms of Indigenous communities, there's some key investments, but overall, we've also said that that this government is going in the wrong direction in some respects, and we're very concerned that even the Liberals may one day say, you know what, we can't afford any of this, and Canadians and especially Indigenous peoples will pay the price.
Yeah, certainly austerity has led to bad water and poor infrastructure on First Nations. You guys we're here just for budget week, and you're off again to your constituencies, so we'll see you again in 3 weeks. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
After the break, the budget also promised over $1 billion of new spending on conservation. We'll talk to someone who says this will benefit Indigenous people. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Still with this year's budget, one of the items was an investment of $1.3 billion over the next 5 years for conservation. $500 million of it will go to creating a $1 billion nature fund. It will do a number of things around conservation. One of them is building Indigenous capacity to help conserve land and species. To talk more about that is Valerie Courtois. She's the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and a driving force behind a program called the Indigenous Guardians.
The Guardianship Program is a huge step for us because it's about preserving the land and preserving culture and preserving language. It's an essential thing to our community.
A guardian acts as the eyes and ears in each respective territory. They ensure that everybody's following all the rules and regulations that are placed in all the GUI laws, our laws.
Welcome to Nation to Nation, Ms. Courtois.
Thank you, Todd.
Now, last year's budget, you were asking for $500 million, and instead you got $25 million, I suppose, as seed money for this Indigenous Guardian project. So where do you think that project will stand after this year's budget announcement?
Well, to me, this year's budget announcement is a recognition that, in fact, Indigenous capacity is important when we're thinking about doing things like increasing our conservation areas or even thinking about reconciliation on the land. Like, for me, reconciliation really only becomes real when we see it on the land and it's working and acting. And to me, the Indigenous Guardians are exactly that. And so the investment that the government made last year in $25 million is really a pilot investment, and we're certainly looking for future investments in that. And we think that there are some possibilities within this $1.3 billion, but we don't know. We're hoping to work with government to figure that out.
So at this point, I mean, you were asking for, I think, 250 projects across the country, which would employ, I think, I read 2,600 people. Are you hoping to come anywhere near that, I suppose, with this year's budget?
I don't know that we'll necessarily reach that level. I think part of why the government thought about doing a pilot investment is it really wanted to figure out what it looks like for them to be a partner at a national scale on these programs. The existing programs have all kind of scaled up from local realities, and so it's really about figuring out what that could look like. But clearly, if the government is looking to achieve its targets of 17% protection and 10% marine areas, the real opportunities for that is on Indigenous lands. And so it's really, to me, I see it as a way for Indigenous peoples to organize and say, now we have a chance to have our voice lead what happens on our lands, and we want to protect those because we need those lands to be who we are.
I suppose at this point you should let our audience know a little bit to exactly what the Indigenous Guardians, what you hope they will do.
Yeah. Well, essentially, Indigenous Guardians, we like to say there are moccasins and mucklucks on the ground. They're essentially our land troops that are on the ground managing both lands and resources, and also the relationships related to those lands and resources. So if you think about the Haida Watchman program, they work with Parks Canada in managing the Guayhanas Park. Or if you think about the Innu Nation in Labrador, there's a number of programs that include some monitoring and surveillance on the Voisey's Bay mine, or monitoring around the Muskrat Falls project, or any of those kind of large development projects.
I think you mentioned, I probably saw in a past report too, you think this this type of monitoring could lower tensions between especially hunters and Indigenous people.
Yeah, what we've seen is that when there are people on the ground for other land users to have a relationship with, that tends to improve things on the ground. And what we've seen in Labrador, if I could speak to my own experience in managing these programs, when we were looking at bringing in forestry in central Labrador, there was a lot of distrust from the settler community in what the government was intending there. And when they saw the Innu Nation had a co-management role and in fact was holding the pen for many of the planning aspects, that brought comfort to the local community that because they know that the Innu Nation is out there to do the right thing for lands.
You mentioned the 10 and 17%. That's the other aspects of this $1.3 billion announcement. So overall, I mean, how significant do you think this investment is in conservation?
Well, to my knowledge, it's a historic investment. I don't know of any other instance where there was such a large investment in conservation in the federal budget. The fact that they've said that this is going to be done in partnership with Indigenous governments and in the spirit of reconciliation and a nation-to-nation relationship are all good things for us to hear. But the devil's in the details. So that's, you know, you may be sensing some hesitation from me in terms of the specifics of the spending. It's because we don't know, and so when that happens, it's we just have to work with government to figure it out. And what we've seen is that in cases of conservation generally in Canada, in the last 20 years, the most innovative, bold, and frankly successful conservation proposals have all come from Indigenous peoples. And so we expect that trend to continue with this new funding.
Of course, this budget really doesn't address the fact that there's often conflict between various levels of government and Indigenous groups and people over how resources are developed or used. How do you get across beyond that? How do you get beyond that confrontation, I suppose, to have this partnership, this nation to nation?
Well, if you think about it, Todd, when we think about consent and the free, prior, and informed consent framework, one of the most difficult parts is the informed part of that scenario. The Guardians really help address that piece. Because they're on the land and they're actively managing, actively talking to land users, looking at plans and maps, talking to communities, working with their own members to make sure that those things don't create conflict, they could really preempt a lot of those issues. And so to me it's common sense, but it's nice to see the government hearing that as well.
Now, I don't know, you know, we talked about protecting marine life and better rules for environment. Do you think this may appease water protectors who have been targeting the oil and gas industry? Is this the type of thing, or maybe not, this just won't help their cause?
Well, I mean, the ultimate authority for these programs need to rest with our nations. So it's really up to the nations to determine what the Guardians are going to be about. So whether you're in northern Manitoba and thinking about how do you deal with hydro realities, or you're in Labrador and you're thinking about the decline of caribou, or, you know, all of those issues, will certainly it'll be up to the nations to decide how they engage on that. Now, if the nation has a position on a particular resource development project, the cool thing about the Guardians is it actually helps them articulate that position in a way that may be helpful in terms of finding solutions in those conflicting situations.
You think if this had happened years ago, we'd be having this kind of conflict in your home territory over Muskrat Falls?
That's a very good question, Todd. I think Muskrat Falls is a particular example where I don't think it's necessarily about all of the groups having a similar position, so it's a little bit of a tough situation. But if I think about my friend and colleague, Bev Sellers, who was the former chief of Soda Creek, or the Hatfield Nation in British Columbia, which was strongly affected by the Mount Polly disaster. And she firmly believes and has said that had there been Guardians looking at and seeing that pond, there may have been a chance to intervene before that spill happened. The Innu have, and the Nunatsiavut Inuit have prevented spills for Voices Bay nickel mine because of their presence. So I think we expect to see that, and hopefully with these investments and the increase in Guardians, we'll start to see those impacts.
Well, I guess once we know some details, I'll probably be calling and asking you to comment it on once again. Thank you for doing this today.
Thank you, Todd.
We'll have more after a short break. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Yesterday, the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples continued its study of Bill C-45. It's better known as the cannabis law, and it's supposed to come into force this July. At committee, witnesses testified on how the new law will affect First Nations. Manny Jules is Chief Commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission. He argued First Nations should have taxation powers over the production and sale of marijuana.
They could be used to finance infrastructure and improve health care and education. In addition to the tax powers, First Nations would be responsible for certain aspects of the regulatory framework, including business licensing, zoning, and enforcement.
Alberta Senator Scott Tanis asked Jules whether this tax would replace a provincial one or be on top of it.
If this government, the federal government, recognizes nation-to-nation discussions, and within that they don't even talk about tax jurisdiction over this area, there's something wrong with that picture, firstly. Yeah. So the way I envision correcting that is that both the federal and provincial governments are going to have to give up tax room for an orderly transition, both. For an orderly transition from those jurisdictions to First Nations.
Randall Phillips is chief of the Oneida on the Thames. One of his concerns is the speed at which Bill C-45 is being pushed through Parliament, something Manitoba Senator Mary Jane McCallum agreed with.
I don't want to be seen as someone that said, okay, let's pass this legislation. I need to be ethical. I need to look at the moral stuff and say, with what I see, I really disagree with how fast this thing is moving, considering that we've known about it for how many years? 2 years?
The First Nations, we didn't bring this law out.
No.
So I appreciate your question. We're going through that same thing. We're not ready for it, but here it is. So unfortunately, we have to get ready for it.
The reason I'm here is to ask for an amendment to Bill C-45 so that First Nations would be in a position to be able to hire their own staff, have their own money for education programs, their own money for health programs, policing, all of those issues that you raised. Yes, there are no resources for it because there is no area where we can tap those resources, at least to an adequate level.
And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcasts. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.